Hey everyone, it's Emily from Life So Savory, and today I'm here with SewTights to tell you all about their amazing magnetic cutting mat system. I have the entire cutting system, which is the cutting mat, the amazing cutting ruler, which we'll talk more about soon, and the magnetic boosters, which are absolutely amazing and life-changing for cutting your quilt pieces, your fabric pieces for bag making or clothes making, or whatever you're doing. Being able to cut out everything using the magnets makes my cutting process so much faster, easier, and I'm so used to it now, I don't think I could go back. So let's first talk about this amazing cutting mat from SewTights. So a self-healing cutting mat is made up of tiny little pieces that as you cut, they sort of meld and self-heal back together. Well, the SewTight mat not only has that initial top layer that heals those tiny plastic pieces back together, it also has a second layer of even softer material under this first layer that you see here that allows for even more healing and gives you a much longer lasting mat than any mat on the market. So this is easy to cut on and will last longer. In addition to those top two layers, you also have a third layer which will increase the durability, allow the cuts to heal more completely, and give you more time before you start to see any wear and tear on your mat. Now, those three layers are on top of the metal layer, which makes it magnetic, and they're actually on each side of the mat. So you'll notice that this mat is double-sided. There's a cutting grid on this side too. And this side of the mat with this cutting grid has those same three layers. So we have three layers, a metal insert, and then the three layers on this side for a 7-layer mat that's going to be durable, easy to cut on, and super long lasting. Before I show you how to cut on here and get into some of the details about this amazing system, I just do want to mention that this can be bought separately or together. Now, in order to use this magnetic cutting mat, if you buy it separately, you're gonna need the boosters, okay? So you want to at least buy the mat and the boosters. You do not have to have this ruler, but we're gonna talk about how precise and amazing this ruler is when we get to the ruler cutting segment of this video, so hold tight to that. All right, let's jump into some specifics about this cutting mat. Okay, here's a closer view of the magnetic cutting ruler, the boosters, which you get 10 in the set, and the cutting mat. Like I mentioned before, it's double-sided, so we're gonna take a quick look at the back side. It's a lighter color gray. I'm gonna go ahead and use the darker color today because my fabric is lighter and this will give it more contrast. But I just wanna show you the entire system as you are taking a look at this. All right, so the most important thing for a self-healing mat is to make sure you're using a really sharp blade. And depending on your rotary cutting tool, this might mean that you are changing your blades pretty often. As soon as you start to see that a cut is not going completely through, you're gonna wanna go ahead and change out your blade, make sure to dispose of it properly, but a sharp cutting blade will allow this mat to heal most successfully and allow you to get the longest life out of it. Another tip for cutting on this self-healing mat is to make sure that you are rotating while you're cutting. If I'm cutting 200 strips of fabric that are 6 inches wide, okay, I don't want to cut every single one of them on this same line. I'm gonna get a deep groove and I'm gonna wear out this part of the mat much quicker. So you can rotate your mat as you're cutting, you can rotate yourself and cut from different sides of the mat, but make sure you're not cutting repetitively on the same line of the mat, and this will allow for longer wear and tear. So the great thing about this SewTights mat is that you don't have to cut on the straight grid line. Some self-healing mats cannot cut if you're cutting on a curved line. And for a clothing or bag designer, this would be really, really bad. So on this mat, you can cut any direction at any time doing the curve. So let's just take a little look at how we would cut this curved little piece that I have for a bag. You're gonna use this same process, whether you're cutting a bag piece or a t-shirt piece or anything that is not a strictly grid-lined geometric shape. So there's a couple ways you can do this. One, you can use your boosters to put and hold your pattern piece down, and then you can just slowly cut around your piece using your sharp rotary cutter and maintaining a completely straight up and down line. And you can see, you can cut around the shape, or you can cut just a straight line there, okay? Then I can take that and I can go around the curve and down the next line. Make sure you're also watching your finger placement. You want to hold it firmly, but you don't want to get your finger in the way. Okay, so I've used the ruler to cut a nice straight edge there where I could, and then I still have this curved line to cut out. So now I can move my boosters back into place so that it stays where I want it, and then I can go ahead and cut the curved part with the blade. And you could do that on a t-shirt pattern or anything. You could use the straight lines, you can use your ruler, especially if you're just getting started and you're not sure how you're gonna cut with just the boosters, you're afraid of slipping or going anywhere, getting crazy with the rotary cutter, then you can go ahead and cut your straight lines with the ruler. But as you're feeling more confident, you can go ahead and just know that your pattern piece is being held in place by the boosters, and that allows you to then just go along and cut what you need to with the rotary cutter. There are different size blades so that you can get more precise depending on the curves that you're cutting. So you can see now, if there's a little bit I didn't cut off, you can remove the boosters, you can take this off, and you have a great piece with rounded corners, t-shirt piece, bag piece, whatever you're making. You can cut the curved pieces using either a combination of the ruler or just using these amazing boosters to help hold it all in place. Some more tips for keeping your cutting mat in good shape. You want to make sure that it stays away from sunshine shining down on it and heat. I often like to iron my fabric. In fact, it's necessary to iron your fabric before cutting so that it lays flat on the cutting mat. But make sure you're not ironing right on top of this cutting mat because that will distort it, warp it, and you don't want any of that. So make sure it's on a flat surface, away from sunlight and away from heat. All right, so like I mentioned before, the next part of this, we will talk about how to use the ruler when we're cutting and how to get accurate cuts using the ruler. And the first thing I want to do to get accurate cuts is make sure that my fabric lays nice and flat on the cutting mat. And so to do that, we're going to make sure we iron. So let's move our cutting mat and press the fabric, not on the cutting mat, just to make sure we have nice flat fabric. Okay, if you have this cutting mat system with the 24 by 20 mat, which is what I have right here, you will have gotten this amazing long ruler, which is 6 by 24 inches and has these great little magnetic holders so that you can put the boosters right on here, and I'll show you more about how to do that in a minute. Okay, so that helps to hold it down. You can also use it for lifting. But if you have this ruler, it has beveled edges on the two short ends. And I just want to note that do not use these beveled edges for cutting because one, it's an inaccurate measurement. From this 1 inch mark to the edge is more than 1 inch because it has that beveled edge, and it will be much harder for you to lay your blade and cut it straight up and down like we just talked about if you use this beveled edge. So you're going to want to use the long straight edges of this particular ruler. Now, if you have the smaller rulers, 6.5 inch square, all 4 of the edges are straight and flat like this one, and so it's not an issue. It's just something to note when you're talking about this particular long ruler from SewTights. Now, before we start, let's talk about this ruler from SewTights. So when they were designing this, they wanted to use the most accurate ruler possible, and you might have seen on sewing sites or just online discussion boards that sometimes people can't get their ruler to line up with a print or a measurement that they have from something else. There's an 1/8 of an inch or a little bit off. Different rulers from different manufacturers can have different measurements. Okay, they're not always exact. But this one strives to be the most accurate on the market, and you might notice a little bit of different from other rulers that you're using. So I just want to note that if you are using a different ruler for a project on this mat, make sure you use the same ruler for the entire project. Don't switch back and forth between this ruler and another one. Or if you don't have this ruler, which you can still use the cutting system, don't switch out rulers in the middle of a project. In order to be precise, you want to use the same ruler for the entire project. This ruler strives to be super precise and works really well with the cutting mat. If you notice, the 1 inches will line up perfectly the squares between the cutting mat and the ruler, and you might not notice that if you're using a different ruler. So just a note and something to be aware of. Another fun feature of this ruler, if you're having trouble picking it up and it's flat on your back, it is magnetized. So it has a little bit of stick to the mat, is you can grab a couple of your boosters, stick them onto the magnetic dots, and then you can use them to pick up your ruler, and you have little handles. It makes it easier to pick this up and slide this around if you use the boosters as handles, and just a good little note to have. You'll see that there are different colors and different markings on either side of the grid, and you can use whichever one works best for you on the mat side that you are using for cutting. Another good thing to remember when you are cutting with this ruler is to press firmly. Yes, it does have these magnets which help it to stick firmly to the mat, but there's still a little bit of slide. So if I'm not holding it with my hand and I'm going to cut this, I might get some movement. You see how that just slid because I wasn't holding it with it. So make sure you are always pressing firmly with one hand and then using the other one to cut up and down straight all along the flat edge of the ruler. All right, so we've ironed our fabric. We have that down. Now let's talk about cutting using the ruler grid and using the mat grid. So when are you going to use the mat grid and when are you going to use the ruler grid for cutting? Well, usually you're using a combination of both, but you might want to use the mat and you might want to use the ruler depending on what you're cutting. Let's take this small scrap of fabric and say we want to cut a square out of it. All right, well, I might use the mat to line up one edge along a grid line to get it nice and flat. Okay, so if it's not a flat, straight edge, then we'll want to cut that one. But if you have one edge, you can go ahead and line it up on a grid line. Then you can use your ruler to cut a second flat, straight edge. So using the grid lines on the mat, not the ruler, I'm not really even paying attention to the ruler. All I'm doing is lining the edge of the ruler up with this white grid line on my mat, and then I'm gonna go ahead and cut that edge right there. So now I have two straight edges on my piece of fabric. Now you might want to use the grid lines on your ruler to cut more than the grid lines on the mat because it just makes it easier. So I'm taking my handle off because my ruler is hanging over the edge, so it's easy to cut. You can see I'm going to go ahead and rotate this to make it easier to cut. I'm going to line up this edge of the ruler with that straight edge of the fabric, and I'm gonna line up one of these black lines on the ruler with this other straight edge of the fabric, okay? We're squaring it up. And as soon as this ruler gets close to the mat, it does magnetize, and you can see it, feel it pulling down. All right, you can see my fabric is not long enough to cut with this ruler because it's not hanging out over the edge, so I can't use this edge. We're gonna slide it over, and I'm going to use this black grid line lined up with the edge of the mat and this other black grid line lined up with the top of the fabric. I'm not paying attention or even looking to the grid lines on the mat, okay? I'm simply using the grid lines that are given to me on the fabric to cut this right now, okay? Can you use the mat? Yes, you absolutely can, but I really like just being able to use that to square up a piece of fabric and make it really easy to get a nice square. So we're gonna do the same thing, okay? We will line up a grid line at the top. We'll use the edge here. You notice I didn't rotate my fabric again to cut here, okay? Because I don't want to keep cutting in the same spot. So I'm rotating either myself or the ruler rather than rotating the mat and the fabric. Okay, and there you go. Now we have a piece of fabric that has 4 straight edges. I didn't really cut it to any specific size, but you can see if you line it up on the mat as well, it lines up with those grid lines perfectly because we use the grid lines on the ruler to cut that piece of fabric. Okay, let's cut another piece of fabric to demonstrate the way that the mat and the ruler play together. So I have this folded piece. It's too long for my mat, but we're gonna start by lining up the folded edge with one of the grid lines along here. And then we're gonna take the ruler and we're gonna line it up along one of the grid lines along here because I wanna cut off this selvage edge. I'm gonna open my scissors and I'm gonna cut it off. I'm gonna cut off a little bit extra of the color. Okay, and now you can see that we have this side squared up. So if you wanted to cut strips of fabric, you could go ahead and just now leave this all in place. So line up this edge with the grid line, leave that folded edge lined up with the grid line, and then let's maybe cut some 2-inch strips. You can see I'm just lifting it from this front edge right here, and then I'm gonna leave this back edge sort of down and place it on the next grid line 2 inches over. I'm pressing firmly with my hand. I also have 2 magnets in place to be able to pick up the ruler, but also if you want more, you could put more magnets. I like to be able to put my hand here, so I'm not putting those 2 magnets. And we're gonna cut a 2-inch strip of fabric. And you can see that it's perfectly cut. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and lift and move again. I like to move the ruler as I'm cutting the fabric into strips rather than moving the fabric. And then again, I'm using different grid lines to cut. All right, so you have those strips. Now, say for example, this one is our selvage, so we're gonna get rid of that. We wanted to turn these strips into squares. Well, we could go ahead and lay them on the mat using a combination of the grid lines on our mat. Okay, so I'm lining up the straight edge with the edge of the fabric, and then I'm gonna line up the edges that are cut here. You don't have to cut 2 strips at once, but I'm always looking for ways to maximize my cutting or minimize my cutting time. So I've lined up the top, I've lined up the edge here, and then you can go ahead and take your ruler and we'll cut 2-inch pieces again, which will give us 2-inch squares of fabric. Okay, lift and move. At this point, I'm using the grid lines on here to line up with the edge of the ruler, but you could also make sure that everything is squared up by lining up the ruler both with the 2 inches on the mat and putting one of these black lines directly along the bottom edge of the fabric. It also should be the top edge, right? Because we have a 2-inch mark. So I'm lined up there, I'm lined up there, I'm lined up here. And now I know that even if my fabric slides a little bit, like I get off grid, for example here, okay, so my fabric gets off grid, I could line it back up, or I can just go ahead and line up my fabric along there, and I know I'll be cutting it straight. Now, I don't know the 2 inches here, so I wanna make sure that I go back and I put that on a mark, line that back up. But you can use a combination of both to achieve your cutting goals and hopefully make your cutting easier and quicker as you learn more about this. Now, SewTights knows that you might need to use different rulers because they only have a couple of sizes. So they're just saying, like I said before, make sure that you are using one consistent ruler for the project that you're making and not switching back and forth. But hopefully this little overview gives you a good idea how the ruler grid interacts with the cutting mat grid and how you can use those together to create perfect squares, shapes with curved edges, or just strips of fabric. So no matter what your cutting needs, whether you're making clothes, bags, or quilts, you should be able to use the SewTight cutting system for your needs. I hope this was informative and you can find out more on the SewTights website.